This was my first decade, and I don't remember much of it. I spent most of it pooping myself and learning how to not poop myself. Today, more than 35 years later, I'm proud to say I almost have the hang of it. Anyway, even though my memories of the 80s are pretty dim, there are a few strong memories. One of the strongest is the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. I didn't really understand what was happening, but the images of that brightly graffitied concrete exploding dramatically on the evening news was captivating even for a 5-year-old. It was the first time that I can remember all of the adults around me being so interested in something that was happening on the TV. It was my first experience with politics, my first awareness that important things were happening beyond my front door, and my first lesson that I should care about those things that happen far, far away to people who I'll probably never meet. A couple years later, the USSR collapsed, and by this time I'd seen enough 80s era action movies to know that the Russians were the bad guys, and I could better comprehend the enormity of that kind of a situation. We'd won. Democracy had won. Freedom had defeated the bad guys and the big funny hats. We'd reached the end of history. The United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights were nearly perfect templates for human society, and one by one the world would adopt our principles of democracy, and that would be that forever and all time. My parents and my teachers and every other adult in my life made sure that I knew that the USA was the greatest nation on earth, that we were the ones who delivered freedom to Europe in both world wars and to Korea, and we tried to do our best in Vietnam, but let's not talk about that too much. And now that the Soviet Union has collapsed, which means we've won, democracy and freedom have also finally won.
Avenge me! Avenge me!
Certainly there was still work to do, which is why my dad, a United States Navy chief, had to sail away during and after Operation Desert Storm. But we had to go there to make sure that they could be free too. I mean, that was really all that was left, right? Invading and bombing a few smaller, less significant places like Iraq and Somalia, Kosovo, you know, the places that didn't have their freedom yet because we hadn't helped them get it yet. That's the way that the United States of America helps smaller countries that are in trouble, right? By bombing and invading them, you know, like in all those movies. Growing up in the 90s, I was convinced that I'd been born into the tail end of history. My formative political memories of the collapse of the Soviet Union merged with grade school social studies lessons and 4th of July parades and overhearing those talk radio shows that my dad listened to in the garage. Everything around me seemed to indicate that all those bad, scary parts of history were well behind me, and I was living at the dawn of a golden age in the greatest nation in history. World peace and prosperity for everyone, delivered by the United States of America's military and capitalism and democratic ideals. And to tell the truth, it all kind of bummed me out. I had watched so many movies and read so many books about World War II and the Civil War and the Age of Sail and knights in shining armor and all that romantic adventure. It just seemed so out of reach to me. Living at the end of the history seemed like it was going to be so boring. I wanted to live in interesting times. All my teachers told me how lucky I was to grow up when and where I did. We didn't have to duck and cover and hide under our desks in fear of nuclear fallout. That kind of fear was all in the past now. We were lucky. Our future would be peaceful, simple, boring. I was a white kid in suburban America, and things were gonna be A-okay. And then, when I was 16.
It's 8:52 here in New York. I'm Bryant Gumbel. We understand that there has been a plane crash on the southern tip of Manhattan. You're looking at the World Trade Center. We understand that a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center.
You can see the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents, and you can see the two towers. A huge explosion now raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way!
I was in my high school filing papers for an assistant principal for some kind of work-study program. I walked down the hallway to go to the restroom, and there were teachers and students clustered around all the classrooms that had TVs. And something important was happening. I peeked into one classroom, afraid I was going to get in trouble for lingering in the hallway, but none of those teachers really noticed or cared about what I was doing. And when I looked at one of the TVs in one of those classrooms, I saw why. My next class period was journalism, where I worked on the student newspaper. It was one of the few classrooms in that late 90s high school that was wired to the internet, and we spent the entire 3 hours of that period frantically scouring the internet for information. And what we were finding was truly horrifying. And I'm not talking about what was really happening, mind you, but I was seeing all of these fake reports. These fledgling news websites were throwing up any fake news they could find. They weren't really doing a lot of verifying. And from what we could tell, there were car bombings and plane crashes and explosions all across the country simultaneously. And I left school that day convinced that the USA was under some kind of full-scale attack. And it was deeply, deeply disturbing. And that was the first time in my life that I came to realize that we weren't quite at the end of history yet. And it was all so confusing. My history and geography teachers never taught me anything about the Middle East. The only thing I knew about that entire region was that we'd invaded Iraq about a decade earlier and we'd won. And now we were suddenly gearing up for war in that region once again, and I didn't know what to make of it. For me, the 90s were a decade of peace and stability and boredom. And the 2000s were supposed to be a decade of the future, of hope, of boundless opportunity. But that's not how things worked out. Instead, the 2000s turned out to be a decade of confusion and hard doses of reality, and that sense of security that I grew up with was ripped away. Not only were we fighting what seemed to be an endless war, but the economy tanked and everyone my age seemed to be struggling no matter what we did. And most everyone I knew did everything we were told to do to get ahead. I grew up with good kids. Most of us were middle class. We had good families who cared about us. We lived in safe suburbs. We stayed in school. We didn't do drugs. We went to college. We worked hard. We pulled and pulled and pulled at our own bootstraps, but we just couldn't get up. As soon as we graduated from college, we got hit with the 2007 financial collapse. We found ourselves struggling in ways we didn't think we'd ever be struggling. A lot of my friends went off to join the military right after high school to fight in those forever wars in the Middle East, and I can understand why. They wanted to live in interesting times, but by the end of the 2000s, those friends were coming home, and they weren't the same as I remembered them. And I guess none of us were really the same as we were growing up in the suburbs in the 90s with the promise of witnessing the end of history. Living in interesting times, it turned out, wasn't as fun and romantic as the movies made it out to be. After 10 years of treading proverbial water and spinning my proverbial tires and getting proverbially nowhere, I'd had enough of the proverbial bullshit that came with living in the USA. So in 2012, I left the USA to move to South Korea for a 1-year English teaching contract, hoping to pay off some of the, substantial debt that I had, just like all my friends, and hoping that I could figure out a new direction in my life, one that would square up more with reality, which turned out to be much harsher than all those adults back in the 90s had made it out to be. I've talked in past videos about how South Korea was a shock to my worldview, how I came to realize for the first time that the USA wasn't the best doggone country on God's green earth, and here was a country that did a lot of things a lot better than we did back home. So I made the decision to stay in Asia. I actually ended up settling into Vietnam, which was about as far and about as different from the USA as I could get. And I tried to forget the USA, to ignore all the politics and violence and strife of my home country. And I remember one time I was sitting around in Seoul talking to a group of my Korean friends, and they were all talking about US politics, and they asked me what I thought about them. And I said I was sick of them. I did my best to ignore the USA. And they all laughed very cynically, and they said, "You can't ignore the United States of America. The USA is everywhere. We have to pay attention to your country's politics because they affect us as much as our own politics. And I didn't think much of it at the time. I kind of laughed it off, but when Donald Trump was elected president of the United States in 2016, those words came back to haunt me. Here was a guy who scared me. Even while I was living in Vietnam, he scared me enough that I started paying attention again. And after years of apolitical disconnect, I dove deep into political theory and history and the news for the first time in a long time because I wanted to try to understand what was going on back home. And the deeper I dug into those things, the more disturbing they got and the more I began to change. At the 80s were the decade in which I spent most of my own time sleeping in my poopy diapers, and the 90s were the decade in which I was sleepwalking through a fantasy about the end of history, and the 2000s were a decade in which I was subdued into apathy by the harshness of reality. Then the 2010s were the decade in which I woke the fuck up and realized that we as humans have got to start making drastic changes if we are going to survive. Which brings us to the 2020s. Now, as I record this video, we are leaping into the 2020s, and it is the 5th decade that I get to witness. And it might be the last in a way. It might be the last for all of us. It might be the last decade in which we really have something resembling free will and hope and an opportunity for a better future. Listen, I never imagined that I would be a guy who cared that much about the environment. I always thought environmentalism was for rich, white, outdoorsy types who wear Patagonia and drive Subarus and eat that muesli stuff that costs like $10 for a little bag, which isn't true, by the way. A recent study showed that white people in the USA care the least about the environment of all ethnicities, and poor people actually care the most of all economic demographics. But anyway, the point is I've always identified as more of an indoors lover. And even when I do go camping, I usually watch Star Trek on my tablet in my tent, you know? It's who I am. But right now, we all need to become environmentalists. Because as it turns out, we do live in very interesting times. Arguably, these are the most interesting times in human history because the choices that we make right now, in the very short term, are going to determine whether we live or die as a species. And we're about to get into that, but first, let's spread some bread.
Spread that bread.
Marxism. Come join me while I make leftist YouTube content. Come on in, comrade.
To submit a trailer, or to download trailers to feature in your own content, visit non-compete.com/breadspread.
At the age of 35, I am fascinated by time. I'm probably about halfway finished with my life, and it feels like I'm just getting started. I can remember graduating from high school so clearly, and the babies that were born on the day I got my diploma will be getting their own high school diplomas this school year. I don't feel that old, but I guess I sorta am. A decade feels so long and yet so short at the same time. I mean, think about it, just over 10 years ago, there were practically no smartphones, no Marvel movies, no Uber, and yeah, we had Netflix, but we had to wait for DVDs to come in the mail. Frickin' DVDs! It made binge watching Buffy such a pain in the ass. I mean, sometimes you'd be cliffhanging from the last episode of the previous season, and the next season's disc would finally show up in the mail and would have a freaking scratch on it, and you'd have to wait another freaking week for a replacement to arrive, a freaking week to find out if Buffy really died when she threw herself into that portal or not. Sucked. Okay, boomer. I know that's what you're thinking. I know how I sound right now, but it really is startling how quickly time goes by, and it matters. It matters now more than ever because we only have about a decade left. The United Nations and most climatologists agree that we only have until about 2030 before global climate change becomes completely irreversible. Global climate change is accelerating at an alarming pace, and when I think about how it was a decade ago when I saw Kick-Ass in the movie theater, well, that freaks me the hell out because that movie still seems hella new to me. And this is what lead actor Aaron Johnson looked like then and what he looks like now. And holy shit, I'm getting old. Aaron Johnson and I are getting frickin' old. But anyway, yeah, a decade isn't really that long, and that should have us all freaked out, is the point I'm trying desperately to make. If we pass the point of no return on global climate change in 10 years, and that's a pretty small if, the truly apocalyptic effects won't kick in until about 2100, but climate change is already occurring, and it's already causing tremendous suffering around the world. Climate change has been a major cause of the Syrian refugee crisis. Climate change is driving migration from Central America towards the USA. Climate change is causing massive coastline and delta erosion in Vietnam, where I live. And as I'm recording this video, Australia is dealing with horrifying wildfires that are displacing thousands of people, and these fires have been significantly intensified by climate change. There's just no escaping from these effects. No matter where you live, things are getting drastically worse at a faster and faster pace, and we have about 10 years to really do something about it. The problem is, nothing will be done about it under the current systems that dominate our world. Capitalism is the cause of climate destruction and climate change, and capitalism is not equipped to deal with it. According to the WWF, no, not that WWF, you silly graphics. Yeah, that WWF. Humanity has destroyed over 60% of animal population since 1970. Jason Moore, an environmental historian and sociologist, is calling this human-caused mass extinction event the Capitalocene, combining the word capitalism with the word Anthropocene, which basically means human-dominated era of planet Earth.
This is an old capitalist trick to say that the problems of the world are the problems created by everyone, when in fact they are the problems created by capital. As a result, we should talk about the Capitalocene, that we have a historical era dominated by capital, and that it was in these centuries that we saw not just a new dominance of commodity production and exchange in transforming global environments, but we saw new ways of seeing and knowing nature with a capital N. That is, nature became something out there, outside of society, and included many non-whites especially, included many women, many people, many humans, perhaps most humans at the time were excluded from humanity and given over to nature. Why? Because if you could turn nature into a set of objects, you could turn nature into a set of cheap objects. And you could use the cheap labor and food and natural resources and energy of the whole planet to support the project of capital accumulation and industrialization in a broad sense.
As Phil McDuff, writing for The Guardian, put it, there's simply no denying that climate change is the result of our current economic and industrial system. Just 100 companies are responsible for 71% of the global emissions that cause climate change. Under capitalism, those 100 companies with their billions and billions of dollars and their deep ties to powerful states are far too powerful for regular people like us to oppose. Capitalist institutions are motivated by one thing and one thing only: increasing profits for shareholders. And as long as these companies are given so much power and leeway under the capitalist mode of production, we will all be powerless to stop the rapid destruction of our planet. In order to reverse climate change, we're going to need to institute measures of degrowth. We're going to have to use processes that are more costly and more sustainable. We're going to have to produce and use less stuff. We're going to have to dismantle massive systems that are currently in place and develop new systems that are harmonious with our planetary ecosystem. And none of this is profitable for shareholders. Capitalism just isn't going to be able to tackle this. You aren't going to see hotshot entrepreneurs and business executives voluntarily driving down profits and investing in sustainable solutions, because capitalism is all and only about the bottom line of profit for shareholders. That is all capitalist institutions are concerned with by definition. The whole selling point of capitalism is that profit drives innovation as innovations drive profits. And the kinds of innovations that lead to profits are exactly what lead to global climate change. Make more stuff, plan obsolescence into that stuff so that people will buy that stuff more often. Make that stuff as cheaply as possible. Use the cheapest materials. Spend billions on marketing so people will buy stuff they don't really need. This mindset is what's killing our planet, and this mindset is capitalism. And liberal reforms are not going to save us. Liberalism is just not equipped to solve these kinds of problems. Liberalism is all about maintaining the status quo and compromising. The best ideas liberals can come up with are compromise solutions like the carbon taxes and the Green New Deal, which are unlikely to be implemented, and even if they are implemented, just won't work. According to a report by Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy, none of the carbon emission taxes being considered are likely to achieve the long-term US emission goal of 80% below 2005 levels by 2050. And even if the Green New Deal managed to completely eliminate all of the carbon emissions in the USA, which it won't, it's not going to stop carbon emissions in the developing world. That's going to require massive global investment from rich countries into poorer countries to help them become more sustainable, with no strings attached, by the way. And no amount of compromise with capitalists and corporations is going to make that kind of change happen. Reform is a long, slow process, especially within the framework of a capitalist liberal state where billionaires and corporate lobbies wield far more power than the working class. Look at this. In 2018, the 10 largest individual donors funneled more than $436 million to super PACs in the most expensive midterm elections ever. And the Economist recently reported on a new study by Columbia University. And according to that study, Republican senators side with wealthy constituents a staggering 86% of the time, while Democrats vote in line with wealthy constituents about 35% of the time. And the Economist leads us to believe that partisanship is much more important than wealth when it comes to influence on politics in the USA, which does seem intuitively true. I mean, Democrats voting with wealthy people about a third of the time does seem way less bad than Republicans voting with wealthy people almost 90% of the time. But let's dig just a little deeper. The study this chart comes from uses standardized income brackets from the Cooperative Congressional Election Study from Harvard University. They rank people in the bottom quintile as poor and the top quintile as rich. And if you don't know what a friggin' quintile is, like me before I made this video, it's just a fifth or 20%. So basically, what this graph is really saying is that even Democratic senators vote with the wealthiest 20% of Americans against the poor about 35% of the time. Now, if things were fair between the rich and the poor in the USA, we should see a much different distribution. But we don't. Even the Democrats side with the rich about 35% of the time, more than double what should be fair, given that the Republicans are voting 90% of the time with wealthy people. Which is why even with the Republicans holding only 52% of the seats in the Senate sides with rich voters 63% of the frickin' time. And that's the real takeaway here. Even with liberal Democrats holding almost half the seats, rich people and corporations have a decisive edge. And it's not just this way in the United States. Liberal elites have proven all over the planet that they value the wealthy over the poor and that they favor corporate profits over the survival of our planet. I'll put links to some studies about similar statistics in France and the United Kingdom, and if you do some basic research, you will find that this pattern repeats itself in capitalist democracies across the planet. Liberal propagandists try to convince us that we can solve these problems with green capitalism, but there's no such thing as green capitalism. Those kinds of solutions will not save the planet. Only major, drastic, systemic change has any hope of reversing global climate change, and that kind of change simply isn't compatible with the capitalist mode of production. So when it comes to so-called democracy under capitalism, the decks are stacked against the poor and working people of the world, and by extension, against the environment, because poor people, working people, we're the first ones that get hit by environmental change. We're the ones that feel it the hardest and the earliest. And liberals just aren't really on our side. And even when they do take our side, for whatever tactical, strategic reasons they might do so, they're strongly opposed by powerful and increasingly fascistic conservative counter-movements, which very clearly favor the interests of the wealthiest and most privileged members of society. If we fight very, very hard, it might be possible to institute the reforms that are needed, but not within a decade. And a decade is all we've got. I firmly believe that the only hope humanity has for survival on this planet is revolutionary change. And 10 years is not a lot of time to build a revolutionary movement, but unfortunately 10 years is what we have, and we're going to have to make the most of it. Yes, the odds are stacked against us, and the chances of pulling off a successful revolution in our current situation are low, but just look at the stakes. If we fail, we are doomed. Now, what do I mean by doomed? What's going to happen if things continue on their current course? It's not too hard to answer that question, actually. Just look at what's happening all around us. Look at what's happening in developed and developing countries. People in poor developing countries are suffering from extreme weather. Yes, that's true. They're also suffering from conflict, and they're forced into fleeing their homelands as refugees. And then developed countries are responding by building walls and concentration camps and doing everything they can to keep the foreigners out. And the stage is thus being set for eco-fascism. What does eco-fascism look like? What will it look like? We're already seeing it in its infancy as rich nations fortify and wall off and demonize outsiders to protect their domestic resources. Left unchecked, they will continue to double down on efforts to invade and imperialize weaker nations to secure even more resources for themselves. And as these resources become more scarce, the conflicts over them will get all the more ugly. We're seeing it all happen right now in a very mask-off manner. Donald Trump makes it very clear on Twitter that the only reason he's interested in the Middle East is for their oil.
We're keeping the oil. We have the oil. The oil is secure. We left troops behind only for the oil.
That is eco-fascism. Imagine how much worse it's going to get as the climate continues to degrade and vital resources become increasingly scarce. We're already seeing crop problems in the developed world. We're going to see more and more crop failures. Food is going to become scarce. Water is going to become scarce as global climate change sets in. And the only way to stave off this dark future is revolutionary change right now in the short term. And what do I mean by revolution? Well, that all depends on how much time we have left when we're having this conversation. I don't believe that right now violent revolution has much of a chance for success in a modern, developed capitalist nation. And even if it did, I don't know for sure that that kind of change, the kind of change that we need to have take place to save the planet, can happen at gunpoint. We need to change the way most of our fellow humans think about and engage with the world. And that calls for a ground-up revolution of culture, of behavior, and creativity. With just a decade left, we do still currently have a few peaceful options available that can empower us to make these kinds of changes. We can build dual power structures like workers' unions and community organizations to stand up against capitalist and state abuses. We can organize and educate and initiate nonviolent direct action campaigns to demand the drastic change that's needed. I have a whole video on nonviolent anarchistic revolutionary strategies, link in the description, so be sure to check that out if you want to learn more about this stuff. And if you happen to be a United States citizen, there's one more thing I want to talk about that you can do right now to improve our chances pretty significantly, and that is support Bernie Sanders. Don't just vote for him. I'm saying get your friends to vote for him. Donate to his campaign if you can. Get this guy in office. Now, I realize it might sound like I'm contradicting myself right now. I was just talking about how we need revolution and not reform, but electing people like Bernie Sanders into office gives us a major strategic victory and a strategic advantage for revolution. Even though Bernie himself is not a revolutionary, he will improve material conditions for revolution. He's the only candidate currently running for United States president with policies like Medicare for all and student loan forgiveness and worker cooperative programs that will take pressure off of the working class, show us that dual power structures can be built in our communities, and that direct action can be applied to change the world around us. And those kinds of programs are what we need to make engaging in revolutionary activity easier and more accessible for more workers. And that's not to say it's going to be easy. Even with Bernie in office, It won't be easy. But if Trump gets in office again, or an outright neoliberal like Biden or Warren, or the judge of booties, or a right-wing libertarian like Yang, well, that's just going to make revolutionary activity that much more of an already uphill battle. And remember, this is a battle. This is a fight for survival. And I know that that sounds super dramatic, but this is friggin' dramatic. We don't need to watch Star Wars or Game of Thrones for a secondhand experience of what it's like to battle a massive and powerful empire of evil for the fate of the world, because right now, you and I are engaged in an epic struggle for the very survival of our planet with an empire of evil. And we need to start acting like it right now. Even revolutionary leftists, even myself, even I, don't act like the stakes are as high as they undeniably are, and we all need to work on that. We have 10 years to institute significant change to the entire world before global climate change is irreversible. Can we all just please let that sink in? It's bitter medicine, I know. I don't like to take it myself, but we all need to keep reminding each other again and again. We are fighting a war. The revolution is happening now, and the future of our planet is literally at stake. Let's start owning that shit. We need to become the badass revolutionary heroes that this planet needs and save ourselves, because nobody else is coming to help us. When I read about Rosa Luxemburg and Che Guevara and Fred Hampton and Catalonian anarchists fighting Franco's fascists and Viet Minh guerrillas risking everything to resist imperialism and Black Panthers boldly fighting for their neighborhoods and all those other revolutionary heroes of history, I'm awestruck. I can't believe that anyone could be that brave. They all seem like real-life superheroes performing impossible feats in service of humanity, but they weren't superhuman. They were just ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. They had no choice but to fight for their own survival, and we are in that situation right now. We are ordinary people, but we live in extraordinary circumstances, and we have every opportunity to step up and be our own heroes. Right this very instant, we are hearing that same call to action that they heard. We are facing the same threat against our freedom and our lives, and we have a chance right now to answer that call. We have the opportunity to fight back, and that is a precious thing. If we do nothing, or if we fail, then the next generation isn't likely to have that same kind of opportunity. Things may look tough right now. They are tough, but imagine what it's going to be like for our children and our grandchildren. Think of how tough they're going to have it if we sit idly by while our world is sold out from under us, given to ruin for the profits of billionaires. Can we all come to terms with the fact that the longer we wait to get serious about this, the harder it's going to get to save our planet? In 5 years, if we haven't made significant progress, we will be in a full-blown crisis mode. Reform will be a completely useless waste of time. Revolutionary demands for systemic change will be the only viable option left on the table at all. In 8 or 9 years, the only options left will be desperate and risky last-ditch efforts at violent uprisings, and even if we do win, which we probably won't, we'll only have a couple of years at the very most to completely overhaul the entire system. It's time for us to start working together. It's time for us to realize that drastic actions are going to have to be taken. We're going to have to work together and form alliances, sometimes with people we don't really like. And if we don't like each other personally, we're going to have to find ways to work through those differences and bridge the gaps that divide the working class. We have to build a united front in solidarity, rooted in the common cause of our survival. We can hate each other, but we have to find ways to focus our energy more on fighting climate change and capitalism than each other. A divided working class is going to spell permanent doom for each and every one of us. The stakes are higher now than they've ever been in human history. This is our last chance at preserving the environment of the only planet known to exist that can support our lives. And we have to try to do all of this knowing that we probably won't be able to, which is why we also need to be preparing for the worst. Now look, I think it's very important for us to be hopeful. We have to believe that revolution is not just possible, but that victory is possible, and we need to fight for victory every single day. But I'm also big on having backup plans. And we need to think about what life is going to be like if things don't go our way. I'm going to drop a link in the description to the Deep Adaptation report, and I strongly encourage all of you to give it a read for its philosophical content. The author of the paper, Dr. Jim Bendell, basically surveyed all the data out there about global climate change and came to the conclusion that we're basically probably totally screwed. Dr. Bendell admits that it's probably disheartening to talk in terms of inevitable near-term social collapse, but reminds us that facts are facts, and the facts aren't looking good. And it's not responsible to deny these facts or to engage in reformist activity that we know is ultimately useless. If we recognize the troubling implications of these facts but respond by busying ourselves on activities that do not arise from a full assessment of the situation, then that is implicative denial. Foster argues that implicative denial is rife within the environmental movement, from dipping into a local transition towns initiative, signing online petitions, or renouncing flying. There are endless ways for people to be doing something without seriously confronting the reality of climate change. There's a lot to unpack in the Deep Adaptation report, and I'll probably do a whole video on it in the future. It certainly warrants one. But one thing it made me realize is that we need to try to keep hope alive no matter what course things take. Corbyn's recent defeat sucked, but we can't let it take the wind out of our sails. If Bernie Sanders doesn't get elected, we have to keep fighting. If we find ourselves facing social collapse, that doesn't mean we get to stop fighting to stay alive. We have to try our best to maintain hope no matter the odds and no matter the situation. And that means we have to be prepared for some really dismal stuff to go down. Which is why I strongly believe that the revolutionary left needs to cultivate a culture and collective mindset of preparation. Yes, you heard me. I'm saying we need to be preppers like those wacky right-wing bunker people, only not exactly. We should be disaster prepping inclusively with our wider communities in mind. Now, right-wing preppers tend to be fixated on their own individual survival in a disaster scenario, but we as leftists should be doing what we can to prepare our communities for the bad situations which are more likely to occur as this decade continues to unfold. We need to be planting community gardens, organizing our neighborhoods, building food pantries and robust food networks, and looking for weak points that might collapse rapidly if national systems are disrupted. And the more we can prepare and organize our communities, the better our chances will be for surviving irreversible climate change if and when it does begin setting in. Only by building strong communities will we be able to withstand the threat of eco-fascism. And a great thing about all of this stuff is that it's also revolutionary activity. Organizing and educating your neighbors doesn't just prepare your communities for the worst, it creates a powerful platform for staving off the worst, and that's pretty cool. I know this all sounds overwhelming. There's so much to do, there's so little time, and it often seems like we're just screaming into a void when we care about this stuff. And over the last couple of decades, things have been rough for all of us, and history has been happening to us in the harshest ways. Well, I say that this decade, the 2020s, is time for us to start happening to history. Now is our time. And I know that this stuff is distressing and overwhelming to grapple with, but we have to grapple with it, and we have to believe that we can win this fight. And we have to work together to save this planet, because this planet is all that we've got. And we are all that we've got. And these next 10 years, they're all that we've got.
Before I could finish my video on this topic, Black Red Guard and Softboy Social Club beat me to the punch. Their videos are better than mine, and that makes me sad. But I guess it will make you happy if you click the links to their videos in the description and subscribe to their channels and stuff. So do that, yeah.
Thank you so much for watching. I'm American Johnson, this is Non-Compete, and I especially want to thank our patrons for supporting us. Basically, nowadays we make almost no money on ad revenue anymore. We make less than a couple $100s a month, and that's with millions and millions of minutes of watch time. It's really not even enough money to pay for the software that we use for our live streams and editing and that sort of thing. So thanks so much to our patrons for supporting us. If you can't afford to make a donation, you can still help us out by liking and commenting and especially sharing the videos. Share this with your friends. Get other people watching it. That helps us a lot. And that's it for now. Take care of each other. We'll see you next time.
25 years ago today, many an American male was outraged at the next fad, which spread to our shores from England. The girls seemed to get an unholy glee out of their dainty dudines as long as the craze lasted. And after a while, nobody noticed because everyone was concentrating on his or her jigsaw puzzle. But everyone. The wheels of industry slowed, traffic came to a standstill, and a lot the puzzlers cared if I could just find that funny-shaped piece. Hey, watch it! Oh no, I gotta start all over.